can a novel be intentionally vulnerable? I mean, why on earth would an author choose to risk that? Laying their work, maybe even themselves, open to criticism. It just feels counterintuitive, doesn't it? Well, that's the really fascinating paradox we're diving into today. We're looking at Jennifer Egan's brilliant historical novel, Manhattan Beach, from 2017. We're going to explore how Egan seems to deliberately play with this idea of vulnerability. Not just in her characters, but woven into the writing itself. It's kind of a masterclass in what some might call strategic storytelling.
Absolutely. And for this deep dive, we've pulled together quite a mix of sources. We're drawing on some really insightful academic analyses, critical reviews that show how people reacted, some foundational literary theory, and also some fascinating interviews with Jennifer Egan herself.
Yeah.
Yeah, she gives some great insights into her process. So our mission here really is to unpack how Egan sort of calculates vulnerability in this book. We want to connect it to these bigger themes, things like national trauma, social injustice, even how narrative itself works. By the end, hopefully you'll see how this novel, which might seem surprisingly traditional at first glance, is actually incredibly self-aware, a strategically vulnerable piece of art. It's all about that intention behind it.
Okay, so let's start with something that really caught my eye, and probably others too. Egan made this really unexpected shift in style with Manhattan Beach. Before this, as you probably know, she was famous for experimental fiction, right? Pushing boundaries, playing with time, different voices. But for this book, she went in a totally different direction, much more traditional, more linear. What was going on there?
Yeah, it definitely raised some eyebrows at the time. Egan herself was pretty upfront about it in interviews around 2017. She basically admitted she was sick of all that so-called innovation, her words, and that it would be a relief to get rid of it. She even called other approaches gimmickry. But what's really interesting is how she linked this change in her writing to, well, a larger historical moment. She said she felt 9/11 was the end of something, or at least a key point in a story that started, with America becoming a superpower after World War II.
Wow.
So it's like the end of that era, for her, maybe signaled a need for a different kind of literary approach, a sort of weariness with constant experimentation, perhaps.
That makes a lot of sense. And it almost sounds like she was walking right into a prediction David Foster Wallace made way back in '93. Wallace talked about the next real literary rebels.
Yeah.
He thought they'd be the ones who would dare go back away from ironic watching, who'd have the childish gall to actually endorse single entendre values. He said they'd treat, old human problems and emotions with real reverence, and that people would accuse them of being sentimental, melodramatic, even too sincere.
So single entendre values. What do you really mean by that? And do you think Egan was sort of knowingly stepping into that risky space, maybe expecting those criticisms?
Well, single entendre values, Wallace is basically talking about moving away from that constant irony and cynicism you saw in a lot of postmodernism, where everything has layers of meaning, often detached. These new rebels, he thought, would go for directness, sincerity, real emotional connection, no more winking at the reader, just straightforward storytelling.
And yeah, it really seems Egan did step right into that. But the interesting thing is, despite her saying she was ditching experimentalism for Manhattan Beach, the critics had a kind of paradoxical reaction. Many scholars, especially in places like PMLA, still called the novel experimental, even while they agreed it felt unexpectedly traditional. They came up with terms like historicist experimentalism to describe it.
Historicist experimentalism. Okay, that's a bit of a mouthful. Can you break that down for us?
Sure. Basically, it's a way of saying that even though the novel looks traditional on the surface of, historical setting, character-driven plot, it's actually experimenting with how we tell historical stories. It's blending older forms with a very modern, self-conscious viewpoint. So even if an author says, I'm going back to basics, critics can still find innovation in how they're engaging with that tradition.
Ah, okay, so it's not just what story is told, but how it's told, even within a traditional frame.
Exactly. It becomes a commentary on the genre itself, in a way.
Got it. Now let's dive into a key character who really seems to embody this whole theme of vulnerability, Lydia Kerrigan. The sources really emphasize that her extreme disability is absolutely central, almost like the foundation of the novel. Lydia, well, she can't walk, she can't talk or have sex. She needs constant care, feeding, washing, dressing. And there's this uncertainty, too, about what she can actually feel or think. And on top of all that, she faces so many other vulnerabilities. She's from a religious minority, incredibly poor, an immigrant female, an abandoned child. And then she's described as extremely beautiful,
Hmm.
which tragically the text notes only makes her disability seem the more regrettable. It's just layers upon layers.
It really is. And what's fascinating from a literary perspective is how Lydia's portrayal connects to this concept called narrative prosthesis. It was developed by scholars David Mitchell and Sharon Snyder. Essentially, it's about how disability often gets used in literature as an opportunistic metaphorical device. Sometimes it kind of locks characters into a specific, almost predetermined role in the plot. In Manhattan Beach, Lydia's disability really functions as the void that inaugurates Egan's narrative. It's not just a character trait, it's described as the primary motor and fuel for the plot's development and structure.
Right, so how does that actually play out with Lydia? How does her condition become the engine of the story?
Well, think about it. Her inability to communicate directly forces everyone around her to interpret her needs, her state, which leads to key misunderstandings and decisions. Her need for constant care is what directly pushes her father, Eddie, into dangerous, illicit work on the docks. That whole storyline involving organized crime and his later disappearance, it stems from that need.
Ah, okay, I see the connection.
And it completely shapes the lives of her sister Anna and their mother. It dictates family roles, responsibilities. Anna takes on what's called a masculine, riskier job as a diver, partly driven by the family situation. She even considers using her sexuality instrumentally to help. It all circles back to Lydia's profound needs. Her condition basically sets the stage for everything that happens.
That's incredibly powerful. So it's clearly not just Lydia's personal tragedy. You mentioned broader implications. How does her vulnerability and the family's struggle connect to a larger, maybe even national sense of vulnerability?
It really does operate on that metaphorical level, too. Lydia's condition, and you could even say her family's surrogate disability, the way their lives are shaped by hers, acts as a symbol for a much bigger societal vulnerability. Some analysis connects it directly to Judith Butler's ideas about unbearable vulnerability, particularly the kind that the 9/11 attacks sort of laid bare at the heart of the whole American imperial dream.
Wow, that's deep.
So Lydia becomes more than just a character. She's almost a stand-in for a systemic weakness, a national fragility, reminding us of this shared human precarity that goes beyond just one person or family.
So the novel, set during World War II, is kind of subtly echoing a much more recent national trauma.
Precisely. It creates this resonance across time.
That's a really powerful link. Okay, speaking of systemic issues and American ideals, let's shift gears a bit to another really key theme in the novel, gambling. How does that fit in with vulnerability, disability, and this idea of the American dream?
Well, the gambling theme is deeply tied to Eddie Kerrigan, Lydia's father. What's fascinating is how he initially sees his daughter's severe condition as what the text calls a fatidic occurrence in the game of life.
Fatidic occurrence.
Meaning like a fateful event, something destined, part of the randomness of life's lottery. He has this deep-seated belief in Lady Luck, almost as a symbol of American exceptionalism, this idea that chance can level the playing field.
Right, the idea that anyone can get lucky.
Exactly, but the core of his character arc is his crushing disillusionment when he realizes the game isn't random at all, it's often rigged. And there's that powerful quote from Eddie, "A crooked game was worse than unfair. It was cosmic violation." It hits him on a really fundamental level. It shakes his whole belief system about America.
And that idea of rigged games becomes this really potent metaphor running through the whole novel, highlighting social injustice, right? You see examples everywhere, systemic corruption involving like union bosses, politicians, shady loan brokers. They're all part of a system that denies real opportunity. And it clearly impacts certain groups more than others.
Yeah.
The working class, women like Anna being shut out of diving jobs purely because she's a woman, and ethnic or racial minorities too. It's a huge contrast to that supposed American dream of equal chances for everyone.
Absolutely. It shows a system fundamentally set up to benefit some and exclude others. And this leads to another tragic point the novel makes. What happens when these different vulnerable groups are sort of turned against each other by the system? The novel really illustrates how seeing vulnerability doesn't always lead to solidarity. Sometimes it does the opposite.
How so?
Well, think about the open war between the Irish and the Italians fighting for control of illegal businesses on the docks. Instead of recognizing their shared enemy in the corrupt system, they blame and fight each other. And Egan gives us this really grim, striking image. When they die, their corpses become indistinguishable from each other, described like the scores of faces interchangeable as pennies. It starkly emphasizes their shared vulnerability in the end, despite the conflict. They're all just victims of the same rigged game.
That's a chilling image. And Eddie himself, the father, he even develops this kind of observational stance, as the sources call it. He watches himself participating in corruption, even contemplating killing Lydia out of despair. It's like he's detached, wasn't really doing what he was doing, he was watching it. That detachment speaks volumes about how people can feel alienated within a system they know is corrupt, doesn't it? Almost absolving themselves.
It really does. It shows that sense of powerlessness, maybe, or a coping mechanism within a deeply unfair system.
Okay, so given all this depth, the deliberate choices Egan made, the layers of symbolism, it's actually quite surprising to hear that the novel got a somewhat mixed reception, isn't it? You mentioned some critics found the sentimentality predictable, even stereotypical. Others called the plot shop-worn and cliché. And apparently, readers on Goodreads had some pretty harsh responses about a potential sequel. I was like, I hope not. It was painful enough reading this one. Ouch. So what's going on there? Why would a novel we're describing as so deep and calculated also get those kinds of reactions?
Well, this loops right back to our central idea. The vulnerable text is a calculated risk. The sources suggest that Egan's own actions around the book's release might be part of this calculation. Think about her promotional interviews. She was remarkably open about really painful personal experiences, her brother's mental illness and suicide, her own feelings of survivor's guilt, her father's Catholicism.
I remember reading some of that.
By putting her own vulnerability out there so publicly, connected to the book's themes, it's argued she was deliberately making the novel itself vulnerable to criticism. It became a calculated risk. It's almost like saying, look, this deals with raw, difficult emotions. It is sentimental in places, and I'm standing by it, vulnerabilities and all.
That's a really interesting way to frame it, kind of preempting the criticism by owning the vulnerability.
Perhaps, and it connects back to Lydia's beauty, too, that paradox we mentioned. On one hand, yes, describing her impossible beauty could lean into what some call sentimental ableism, making disability acceptable only if packaged with beauty.
Right, the idea that it softens the blow somehow.
But the novel also uses language like incredibly delicate beauty. Everything around her is depicted as almost luxurious, the lilac shampoo, the Belgian lace nightie. Her sister and mother look at her beauty with almost reverence, like she's a secret princess.
So it's suggesting her vulnerability actually makes her more precious, maybe, not less.
It seems to lean that way, yes. It complicates the purely sentimental reading. And this connects to how other vulnerabilities are depicted too, often with this kind of lyrical tenderness. Think about Mr. Grasky, the character with the hole in his side from the Great War that hadn't healed in 16 years. That detail isn't just clinical, it's presented in lyrical terms, evoking tenderness.
16 years. Wait, you mentioned 9/11 earlier. Is that significant?
It is. The time span of that unhealed wound, 16 years, is exactly the time between the 9/11 attacks and the novel's publication in 2017.
Wow. That can't be a coincidence.
Highly unlikely. It functions as this subtle but powerful echo. This lingering physical wound from a past war becomes a symbol for the ongoing affliction endured by those who survive war trauma, and, by extension, national trauma. It connects the historical setting to contemporary pain.
So even a seemingly minor detail carries this huge symbolic weight, linking eras of vulnerability.
Precisely. It shows how carefully crafted the novel is, embedding these connections.
And then there's the ending, with that incredibly symbolic fog. It's described so vividly, solid-looking enough to mold with your hands, engulfing whole cities like amnesia, and looking like the aftermath of a silent, distant explosion. How does that powerful imagery work as a proleptic connection, like a foreshadowing between World War II and 9/11? And what's it saying about that burdensome sense of an innocence lost?
That fog is such a potent image. It acts as a kind of narrative closure, but also gestures towards the future, linking these two major periods of American vulnerability, WWII, and the post-9/11 era. It's proleptic because it evokes that disorienting, pervasive aftermath of a huge event, much like the atmosphere after 9/11. It suggests a kind of collective amnesia, maybe, or just the heavy weight of a world changed and innocence gone.
A shared sense of loss.
Exactly, and it circles back to Egan's strategy. She framed her own turn towards finding beauty, even lyricism, in the face of vulnerability, as her own survival mode. Which leads to this fascinating idea from the sources. Pretty girls don't play dice. Instead, they calculate the risks of fair narrative game. Egan is playing a calculated game here, blending narrative prosthesis, this lyrical beauty, and a clear social commitment as strategic ways to build resilience, both in her characters and maybe in the narrative itself.
So wrapping up this deep dive, it's really clear that Jennifer Egan's Manhattan Beach isn't just your standard historical novel. Not at all. It's this incredibly self-aware text that uses vulnerability in its characters, its style, maybe even from the author herself, as this powerful, calculated tool. It's using vulnerability to talk about big things like national trauma and social injustice. It's not just a story about being vulnerable. The book itself is vulnerable, intentionally so.
Exactly. And that leaves us, and you, our listener, with a really provocative thought to chew on. What does it actually mean for an author to choose to make their art vulnerable? To invite criticism, perhaps? Or to portray what some sources call uninhabitable identification, trying to get readers to connect with suffering so extreme it almost defies empathy? How might thinking about this kind of calculated vulnerability in literature change how you read stories, how you engage with narratives, and maybe even how you think about our shared human experience of precariousness, of vulnerability out there in the real world?